Oh man, it still smells like pizza right here. I'm surprised more you didn't run off to Sunday school, but that's all right. All right. So, this familiar story, probably to many of us, if not most of us, as it was being read, and you hopefully were picturing the story in your mind, and putting yourself in the position of thinking, what must it have been like to be there? This is one of those stories that is apparently a very big deal. Right? And one of the reasons we know that it is a big deal is this is the only miracle outside of the resurrection. This is the only miracle that actually appears in all four Gospels. So all four Gospels, each of them telling their own sort of version of the life of Jesus. There's only one miracle story that they all have in common, and it's this one, because obviously the disciples were like us, and they really liked food. So everybody remembers the one about the food. So you can read this in different versions of it, and each version also includes or excludes different sets of details, right? So in one of the versions, we were told that there were 5,000 people, but the 5,000 were only counting the men because apparently we were kind of that way back then. And what it probably meant is there's actually closer to 10 or maybe even 12,000 people who were gathering around to hear and listen to Jesus. Now, the reason I wanted to read this version is that this version introduces a character into the story that the other ones leave out. And the character that this one adds in is the little boy. So in the other tellings of the story in Matthew and Mark and Luke's version of it, they just happen to have the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. They don't mention the boy, but this version does. And I like the fact that that they include that detail because I think the boy and the fact that he is there is important. So if you can sort of picture the scene, right? Jesus is around. He's probably in some far off place, right? He's not in the middle of town because you couldn't put 12,000 people in the middle of town. He's off in a field. He's away from everybody. Everybody is away from their homes. Again, no bikes, no trains, nothing like that. Everybody walked to wherever he was. And in order to eat, they were going to have to walk back home. So Jesus sees this scene and he's like, you know what? We need to do something for all of these folks. And so one of the disciples pops up and says, well, all we have are these 5 loaves and these 2 fish. And actually, we don't have them. All we have is there's this boy over here with these 5 loaves and 2 fish. And the thing that we're not told kind of immediately in the story is, why on earth is there a boy hanging out with the disciples with 5 loaves and 2 fish? Right? That's a kind of a big lunch, right? I mean, 5 loaves of bread. Now, admittedly, I have a growing teenage boy in my house, so I know how they are. But I would still be surprised if he took down 5 loaves of bread and 2 whole fish, right? I mean, that's clearly something else is going on here. And I think it's pretty easy to see what's going on is that the boy had brought this, and he had brought it, and that is, the 5 loaves and 2 fishes is just about the right amount of food for Jesus and his disciples. So what is kind of clear is that the boy's here offering something for them, right? Making sure that the disciples and Jesus and those folks are being taken care of. That was the intention and the purpose for it. And then Jesus decides to do something else with it. And instead, we get the story that we get today, where what started off as just enough for a small handful of people becomes enough for more people to eat than lived in the town I grew up in. That's a lot of food, and there's a reason why. It's no reason why this story maintains today. I like this story for a lot of reasons, and one of the things that I think this story is designed to tell us and remind us of, sometimes we can look at the things we have or where we are in life or whatever and not think very much of it. But God has this amazing ability to take what looks sort of humble and meager in our eyes and turn it into something big. This is a story where the disciples are looking at what they have and thinking, this is just barely enough. And God looks at it and says, not only is it enough, wait and see what we can do with it. God is helping the disciples understand, and in challenging in that moment the disciples to think bigger than they are currently thinking. And I think for a lot of us, we resist the idea of thinking too big. Mostly, and I know for myself, the reason that I try to resist the idea of thinking bigger than I should is that we don't want to be disappointed, right? We don't want to dream too big because the bigger we dream, it feels like the harder it is to get there, and maybe we will be disappointed if the big dreams we have don't come true. So it's better to just not dream big in the first place. Jesus is telling us something different, and he's showing the disciples something different, and he's giving them permission in this to take seriously what God can do, take seriously God's challenge to them, and take seriously this idea that with God's help, big things are possible. And if we think about it, Jesus needs the disciples to believe this, because he knows where this story is going. He knows where his life will go. He knows what he will have to do, and he knows it will be up to the disciples to continue the work after he is gone. And if they don't believe that big things are possible, if they don't believe that they can continue to work, if they don't believe that they can actually share the good news both there and where they are, but to the ends of the earth, if they don't believe that, none of us are here today. The good news gets lost and the world misses out. So he is teaching them and training them and helping them understand that they have to be willing to think big. All right, so I want to tell you a story about a guy lived a long time ago named William Wesley Van Orsdale. What a name! Like that's quite a handle, right? And he was born in 1842 in Pennsylvania, actually right next to Gettysburg. And he was born to a Dutch family, as you might expect, and kind of grew up in a rural and poor upbringing. But you can also imagine with that word Wesley in there, he also grew up in a Methodist house. When he was a teenager, he was actually a teenager when the Battle of Gettysburg happened. He visited the battlefield the day after, witnessed and saw and heard testimony of all the terrible things that happened there. Later on, he actually got to be there when the cemetery was dedicated and Abraham Lincoln gave his famous Gettysburg Address. And one of the things that he writes about and talks about is the one thing he took away from the Gettysburg Address was the one little line where Abraham Lincoln talks about, at the end, us being a nation and us being a nation under God. And what he took that to mean, what Lincoln meant it, how that phrase was used at the time, was the idea of being under God meant with God's help. And it's a phrase that William would use over and over and over again in his life when he would talk about the things and the work that he would do. He would talk about often the work that he was doing being under God, meaning the work that he is doing because he's doing it with God's help. And he recognized early on that if he was going to do anything, especially if he was going to do some of the big things he dreamed of doing, then he was going to need help, and he knew where his help would come from. Now, William wouldn't spend his whole life in Pennsylvania because God had put something on his heart and in his mind. He had read some articles about, articles and some newspaper clippings about where, of course, the true promised land for all people was, which, of course, is the state of Montana. We all know this. So in 1872, he found his way to St. Louis, where he tried to board a riverboat. Now, they wanted to take the riverboat all the way up, because that's where they went back then, and it goes all the way up, and this one all the way up and ended in Fort Benton, Montana. And if you don't know where that is, you should. There you go. The fee, unfortunately, the fee to get there, though, was $100, and he didn't have it. And in fact, he showed up in St. Louis with $5 in his pocket. And so he went to the captain and asked the captain if he could work it off or if he could do something, if there's any way he could get passage on the ship. And the captain looked at this young man and said, "Why is it that you want to go to Montana?" And William responded, "Oh, I want to go to sing and to pray and to preach a little and to help people be good." That was his calling. And the captain, in William's telling, responded, "I've been running this boat for a good many years, but you are the first person I have met going to Montana for such a purpose as that." And he did get passage on the boat, and he did go up there. And the day that he landed in Fort Benton, that afternoon, he set about his task because he knew he wanted to be there, and he knew he wanted to preach. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to go to this place that he feared the good news wasn't being shared, where people, and he wanted to be the one to bring it there. And so he chose that afternoon to walk into the saloon and decide that this would be the best place and the best time to start preaching to anyone who happened to be there in that afternoon, which went probably about as well as you think it went, which is to say, not well at all. But he tried, and then he tried again, and then he persisted again. And then finally they found him a little place across the street in a building that didn't actually have a roof on it anymore, just to basically get him out of the saloon because he was bugging everybody. And that was the beginning of the ministry of a guy that would later on become known as Brother Van. And if you know anything, and if you've been around Methodism in Montana, you will know that Brother Van is a pretty big deal. And really, in many ways, the patron saint of Methodism in Montana. Though when he originally arrived, he was just a young man with not $5 in his pocket and a dream to do something big and do something important. Throughout his life, Brother Van would spend the rest of his life preaching and moving around the state. And he would eventually start recruiting other pastors to come in and work in some of these churches that he was organizing. He was the original kind of circuit rider for the state and would sort of go to place and organize people into these little communities. And then he would send word back east and try to entice pastors to come out and serve these churches he was helped set up. There is this great letter that exists from actually the wife of one of the pastors he recruits. And the wife writes him a letter that says, "Brother Van, you promised us that where we were going was going to be like this, and it was going to be wonderful, and it was going to be amazing. And instead, when we arrived, we found a town full of nothing but sinful drunkards, with not a paved road to be found, and not a wisp of civilization." And Brother Van responded back, "My dear lady, I must confess I am sometimes prone to seeing things as they could be instead of how they actually are." What an amazing gift. Throughout his time, he would actually organize a number of churches while he was there, but he wasn't content just doing that because he recognized those were not the only needs present. Brother Van, through his work, actually organized the first hospital in the state of Montana in Great Falls and would go on to organize 6 more hospitals. He would organize what would become known, organize the first children's home because he recognized that they were living in a place where a lot of the work that people did was dangerous and hard. And so when people did bring them families out, it wasn't uncommon for children to end up orphaned because of the hard work and the conditions around them. So Montana, even being a small territory at the time, still had a lot of children without parents. So he organized the first children's home, which would become known as Intermountain Children's Home, still exists today. The hospital still exists today. He would organize the first university in the state that would eventually get combined and become Rocky Mountain College in Billings. And would then also continue to organize about 70 to 80% of the churches that exist there. You can look back at that life and you can say, that is an amazing piece of work. You can look back at all of the things that he did and say, oh my gosh, how could someone do so much? How could he dream that big? I don't think I could do that. And the thing we have to face is, Brother Van, as amazing as he was, really was no different than any of the rest of us. The difference is, he was willing to see things as they could be. He was willing to dream big and do his work with God's help. When you drive by those churches today, or if you were cared for in those hospitals, one of which was a hospital where my son was born, and one of them was a hospital where my wife worked, same hospital. Or if you're educated in the schools, it's easy to take for granted that those things exist. It's easy not to concern yourself where they came from. It's easy to just simply say, well, there is this thing, and it must have always been here, and it's obvious that it's needed, and not think about what it took to build it in the first place. I don't know that all the 5,000 people, or probably 12,000 people that were hanging around Jesus, really understood where the bread and the food they were eating came from. I don't know that they really did understand the miracle they were witnessing. For some of them, it was just, no doubt, probably just a nice free meal. But Jesus knew, and the disciples knew, and we know what actually happened. Jesus saw a need, his people saw a need. The disciples tried to think too small, and Jesus challenged them to dream big, to think about what they have, not as something meager, but to expect that God can take it and turn it into an abundance. This is the amazing ability of God. This is the amazing ability we witness through Christ, is God's ability to take what looks like very little and turn it into something that is quite a lot. And when people, both those disciples that day and all those who would come after, are willing to do the same, when they are willing to allow themselves to dream and think and be in the way that Jesus was, and the way that the disciples were learning to do, amazing and big things can happen. They might not always happen where we want them to. They won't always happen when we want them to. Brother Van did not go there necessarily to found 7 hospitals and a university. But along the way, he saw the need, looked around at what he had and who was around him, and decided to trust that with God's help, these big things that needed doing, these big things that needed building, could actually be built. We must remember, when we sometimes are prone to limit what we think we can do, or limit what we think we can achieve, both individually or as a group, we are not only limiting ourselves, we are limiting God. And when we do that, we're probably in the wrong place. God challenges us to think. God challenges us to dream. God challenges us to remember that we are God's beloved children and that we are inheritors of all the grace and all the work that he did for us. So we should always be challenging ourselves to see the world the way that God sees it, to maybe not always see it exactly as it is, but allow ourselves to see things as they could be. Amen.